years to grasp what the difference was, and the difference was the following. In Shell, we were telling stories about what might happen so that the company could adapt and survive to whatever happened. So the classical use of scenarios, whether it's in the military or in the corporate sector, is with an adaptive stance. We start with the assumption that we can't influence the outcome. The question is, how can we adapt to whatever happens? Whereas the people in the room at the Montfort Conference Center were not simply trying to adapt to whatever happened. These were people, in spite of all of their differences, who had sacrificed enormously, who'd been in prison, in exile, who'd been working for years. They weren't there just to adapt. They were there because they wanted to create a better future for South Africa. And what I realized is that this shift from an adaptive stance to an activist stance is fundamental. And although the methodology is the same, the energy and the impacts are completely different. So, as you can imagine, perhaps as a young man, this was a very dramatic experience for me. I really fell in love with this way of working, which I've never heard of before. I didn't know it was possible for people of the greatest diversity who didn't agree, who didn't like each other, who've been trying to kill each other, to work together in this way. I fell in love with South Africa, which is a beautiful country, really full of energy and life in spite of all its problems, as you may have seen during our wonderful World Cup. I also fell in love with the woman who was the organizer of the project. So by the end of the project, I had resigned from Shell and emigrated from London to Cape Town and married the organizer of the project. So altogether, a very successful project, I would say. I'm not sure if there's any young people or young officers in the audience here. It's hard to see with the lights, but I have to say that you cannot do this with every project. Okay, so this is the first story and the first model. This is how I got started. When I left Shell, we founded the organization, which is now Rio's Partners, and tried to follow this thread of working together, of how to help groups of actors work together on problems of high dynamic, social, and generative complexity. We ended up working in this way all over the world in the 20 years since that first experience. The general approach, which we've used in all of these places, is the so-called change lab approach, which just means, in essence, creating a coalition of actors from across a whole social system to work together on the situation that they're all concerned about, but that none of them can address alone. So this is a general approach, and then specifically, in many but not all of these contexts, use the particular version of the change lab, which is the scenario method, where this construction of a shared set of maps about what might happen is a central task. I wanted to tell you two other stories to explain how our understanding of this method, of this approach, has evolved, and particularly how we understand the essence of what's required. In a way, the scenarios are the subject of the conversation, but there's something deeper going on, which I sensed in Montfort, but we have only gradually uncovered over the 20 years since then. The second story that I want to tell you is the story of the work in Guatemala that we started in 1998. Some of you may know something about the history of Guatemala. It's a small country, only 7 million people in Central America. It has the dubious distinction of having had the longest running and most brutal civil war in the Americas, 1960 to 1936. 1 million people internally displaced out of a total population of only 7 million. 100,000 people murdered, mostly by the state. It was really one of the great successes of international peacekeeping of the 1990s, is that a peace treaty was signed in 1996, but then the question became, how can we begin to repair this social fabric which has been so terribly torn by this brutal conflict. Of course, there were many efforts to rebuild the country after the peace treaty, many activities to implement the peace accords, but one of these activities was a project similar to Montclair, based on Montclair, which was called Vision Guatemala. Vision Guatemala. Vision Guatemala was like Montclair, except that the participants were even more diverse and at a higher level. There were cabinet ministers, university presidents, army generals, commanders of the just demobilized guerrilla forces, young people, indigenous people, etc. And the Vision Guatemala team worked together for several years, also using this change lab approach, this scenario approach. And the reason I'm telling you the Vision Guatemala story is that the fruit of this team was not so much they produced scenarios, which I won't go over now, but the fruit of the effort was much, much larger than simply stories about what might happen. And the team members, not necessarily all together, but separately in sub-teams, informed by the work they had done together, became involved in many, many important activities, informed by the relationships they had formed, informed by the learning they had undertaken, whether it was work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, work on tax accords, work on anti-poverty strategy, etc. So there was something that was particularly fruitful about this activity. The head of the United Nations in Guatemala, the late Lars Franklin, said if you want to understand the implications or the significance of Vision Guatemala, look at the seeds that it planted to help regrow the social fabric of Guatemala. The way we've come to understand this is that these processes, these scenario processes, do not simply produce stories. That's the most visible product. So the first of the products is they produce insights, shared understandings, a shared language, shared models about what's really going on here, how can we understand the situation, how might it unfold, what does that mean. But in a highly polarized context, equally importantly, it produces relationships, bridges across the divides, alliances, teams, and finally it produces shared intention and commitment. And it's out of those three results, the insights, the relationships, and the intentions, that actions can flow. And that's why we've drawn it as a three-legged stool. The actions to create a better future arise not simply from the intellectual product of the scenarios, but also from the cross-sectoral relationships and the intentions and commitments which are formed through this experience of working together. Let me go deeper here, because I think there's something much more fundamental happening in these processes. When I say that people talk together, they talk about what is happening and might happen, this is only the surface level description of the dynamic. So I think if you want to understand